Hello, everybody. Welcome to the final week of the class, week 10. Hope everybody had a good weekend. A few announcements before we get started. First, your research proposal is due this Friday. So refer to the assignment guidelines that I posted on Canvas about how to submit it. Essentially, it's due on Friday, which means anytime on Friday, all the way up till midnight. I want you to email it to me. Email it to me in a Word doc, or a PDF would be fine too. Yeah, not too much more to say about that. Just do your best to get it to me on time. Also, citations are in APA, so the entire document itself does not need to follow APA guidelines. I know some people have been confused about that. But essentially, I just want to make sure that when you guys are doing your citations, that you're doing them in the APA format. Okay, so some good news. I'm not going to post the Repco reading for this week because I want you guys to take the time this week to focus on writing your proposals. I don't want to give you something else to read, but there is going to be a discussion question on Wednesday. So please participate in that. It will count towards your participation grades. And essentially it's going to be sort of a reflective discussion about the course, what you learned, which you wish you would have heard more about. So yeah, please participate in that. Oh yeah, on quiz 4, I had marked an answer wrong. So it had to do with the question about random sampling and qualitative strategies, which are not random, but rather purposeful. The sample's purposefully selected. I had marked that as true when in fact it was false. So I've gone in, I've corrected that question, I've corrected all your grades. So if you see a problem with that, something that the correct grade is not showing up for you, shoot me an email and I will correct that. But I think we should be good to go. Finally, let's see, evaluations, right? So I think course evaluations are open until this Friday. So if you get a chance, please take a few minutes to fill out a course evaluation of this course. Okay, so I thought what we do today is just do a sort of course overview, course summary, try to hit some of the high points of the course, and hopefully it'll clarify if you have any sort of lingering questions or things like that. We can try to cover those a little bit. Okay, so research methods, right? What are we talking about? Essentially, it's a way to structure an inquiry or a question that you have in such a way that you can approach it in sort of a scientific manner, right? Or at least if scientific is a loaded term, we could say we can approach it in a structured way, right? In a systematic way, maybe a better way to say it. So how do you ask a question and find out the answers in a reliable, valid, and systematic way? And that's what research methods is all about. Now, I'm sure you didn't realize when you were taking this class that research methods is about a lot more than simply which method do I use, right? Do I do an interview? Do I do a survey? How do I construct surveys? Things like that. Turns out there's a lot more to it than that, right? Academics always have to make things harder than they seem to be. So you have to start with a research design, right? That's sort of the foundation of conducting a research project. And there are three elements so the three types of designs that Creswell talks about are qualitative, quantitative, and mixed methods, right? And there are three elements of those designs. You've got your philosophical worldview, which, remember, it could be something like post-positivist or positivist, which is sort of the traditional scientific methodology, scientific method, or it could be something like social constructivism, that argues that there is no objective social reality, but everything's constructed, by individual participants and their interactions. or pragmatism, whatever works, right? If it works, if it seems to work, then there's some validity to that particular worldview. So you've got your worldview, right? That's sort of the starting point, and that is important because that's where all of our assumptions about the way the world works exist, right? So if we're coming from a positivist perspective, we have the assumption that if we take the scientific method and apply it to these particular problems, and remember, we're dealing in ISS, we're dealing primarily with social problems, right? So if we take the scientific method, the traditional scientific method, and apply it to a particular social problem or social question, then we can arrive at, if it's done correctly, we can arrive at some sort of objective truth about that particular question. So, if you have those assumptions, which many of us do, right? I mean, we grew up learning about the scientific method and things like that. Then maybe that's where your worldview is coming from, right? But perhaps you've tried the scientific method in the past and you've seen that maybe the application of those principles doesn't address things like power inequalities in society, right? So maybe it doesn't address this notion of white privilege or something like that, right? So then you're starting to get more into more of the social constructionist, critical theory, things like that, that say that, look, this traditional scientific method doesn't necessarily always work when we're dealing with social questions. They tend to be a bit more complex than what we're giving them credit for. So, depending upon your perspective, largely is going to determine what sort of philosophical worldview you align with. And, those are often aligned with certain types of disciplines, right? So within social sciences, psychology tends to be much more in sort of the positivist tradition, right? In a very scientific experiment kind of way, right? Whereas things like sociology tend to be more along the lines of, constructivism, something like that. And then you have within those philosophical worldviews, you have, strategies of inquiry, right? And that's where we're talking about things like, so we're starting off the 10,000 foot, and then we go down a bit, and we're talking about things like, so within, within qualitative, within a qualitative research design, you have the social constructionist worldview. You have things like, let's say, grounded theory is a type of research that you can do with constructivism or ethnography or case studies or things like that. So we break it down to that level. And then after we do that, we finally drill down to the actual methods, right? So if you're coming from a social constructivist perspective and you want to use a grounded theory approach, maybe what you do is you choose qualitative interviews to do, right? That's your research method. So you have to drill down quite a bit after you sort of start, thinking about your question and your topic before you actually get to the methods themselves. Lit review, obviously, that's important, right? It's important in a lot of ways. So you have your topic, you have your question. I'm interested in aerial surveillance. Let's say that's what I'm interested in. So you have to start reading about aerial surveillance, right? That's it makes sense. That's the first strategy, right? If you have a question about something, which most of us do, hopefully all of us do, right? For this class, you read, right? We go to the literature and see, has there been an answer provided for this question that's already been done? And in a wide majority of cases, there is an answer, right? Try searching for something on Google. Anything you can think of, somebody's provided some sort of answer. Now, granted, it may not be a reliable answer, but somebody has probably thought about this particular question, and that's why it's really important, and that's why it's so difficult to write good research questions, and so important because you have to find the gaps, right? You have to find the gaps in the literature. So not only are you educating yourself on the topic so you can, write intelligently about it, but you're also identifying gaps. That's probably the primary, as far as research goes, the primary role of the lit review is to identify the gaps. And then you have to design your questions in such a way to say, okay, well, somebody, thought about civic engagement and somebody's thought about the military, but nobody's really thought about, does the military affect sort of civic engagement, right? So I designed my question in that way. And that's the question that I decide to research ultimately. So, oh yeah, and something else with the lit review, if you're doing it right, it's going to be extensive, right? And I mean, that's the real challenge, right? I mean, for this, we're doing hypothetical research projects. But if you're doing an actual research project, you're going to need to read a lot, 25, 30, 50, articles and books on your chosen topic. So if you're going to do that, you have to have a way to systematically organize, right? He talked about a literature map in this book, which I think is fine, and it's kind of cool because it shows the different connections. It's kind of like that mind map kind of thing. Or, you can just do a simple table, right, where you've got the author, you've got the discipline, you've got the book, then maybe you put like a basic synopsis of that, right? So you don't have to, that way, when you're reading through something, like, didn't I read this before? You can turn to your table and say, oh, okay, yeah, Jones talked about this, in this particular article or whatever. Otherwise, you get lost. That's like, what did I read? How do I remember that? So you need to have some way to organize your lit review. Theory, right? Theory is interesting. If our goal is to explain, right? If we think we can come up with some sort of explanation for our question, why things are the way they are, right? That's where theory comes in, right? Theory is sort of this reliable and tested explanation for a particular phenomenon or occurrence. And they play different roles, right, in qualitative and quantitative research, right? In quantitative research, primarily what you're doing is you're testing theories, right? Somebody you read in the literature, somebody had this theory you thought was interesting. Now you want to test it, right? So you study the relationship between these two variables to see if it makes sense. Perhaps you're using some sort of null hypothesis to show that there is no relationship there, right? Or maybe you're looking at a different intervening variable. You think that when somebody posited this connection between military sexual trauma and suicide among female veterans, that they really didn't look at the person's, socioeconomic status or something like that, right? So it's theory testing, right? Whereas with qualitative, oftentimes, if it's not, it can be theory building, right? Such as in a grounded theory strategy, or it can be sort of like the beginnings of theory crafting, right? You find these really important observations. And maybe then you use some sort of quantitative methodology. You develop a hypothesis or a theory, and then you can apply a quantitative method to it to test that. You test your theory in that way. Ethics, right? Because we're doing social science, we're dealing with people primarily, right? And when you're dealing with people, you have to make sure that you're protecting the people who are in your study, right? Because we've seen in the past, when safeguards aren't put into place, people take liberties, right? It's that old question of, does the end justify the means? In a lot of cases, scientists have said yes, and they've done some pretty deplorable things for that. So that's what led to the Belmont Report and the Belmont Commission and the creation of the institutional review boards. So if you're working with human subjects, you're going to have to develop your proposal and you have to send it to the IRB, right? Just going to they're sort of the ethics, lifeguard, right? Safeguard. Make sure that you're not transgressing the rights of other individuals. Okay, so those were sort of the preliminary things that Creswell talked about in the first half of the book. And the second half of the book were the actual strategies. How do you go about writing it? I think this is really useful, and I hope that you guys have really utilized this, because he has a lot of great templates and scripts and things like that in place that you can utilize to write your proposal. So yeah, he talked about the intro, right? And this is where he talks about that deficiencies model, right? And that's essentially what I just said, right? So your intro needs to have at least three things, right? It needs to have the research problem. So that's the big, you know, uh, you know, painkiller abuse amongst a certain population. Whatever the major problem is that you're really interested in, right? So you've got your research problem. And then you have to have your purpose, right? So here's the problem. Um, here's the purpose of my study. I want to understand, a particular aspect of this problem. And then once you have that, that sort of goes down into your research questions. So I have this big problem. I want to study this particular aspect of it. Here's how I'm going to do it. Here are the questions that I'm going to ask to do that. With the deficiencies model, right? It's essentially what I was talking about earlier, right? You start with your research problem, you do your lit review, you find deficiencies in the lit review, then you formulate sort of your purpose statement, and then you have your research question. So remember, when you're doing the intro, use the deficiencies model. Purpose statement, he provides scripts for both quantitative or qualitative, right? Because remember, you're doing different things. Your purpose is different in a quantitative and a qualitative and a mixed method study if you decide to go that route. So pay attention to those scripts. Obviously, if you're doing qualitative, remember that your strategy of inquiry plays a big part, right? So you need to keep that in the back of your mind. Then you actually come to your research questions, and he talks about the distinctions between the two. You're asking different questions, right? And oftentimes, when you're deciding whether your project should be quantitative or qualitative, think about the questions you want answered, right? If you want to understand if there's a causal relationship between something, right? Maybe that's pointing you towards the sort of the why. That could be pointing you towards quantitative, right? A quantitative study, because that's where supposedly the stronger causal relationships are shown, right? Through statistical analysis. At least it's certainly more well accepted within the scientific community. But if you're more interested in exploring a particular concept, right, or something that you think has not been well understood, right, or perhaps there was even a quantitative study that was done, and you think they didn't do a very good job of unpacking what civic engagement means, or what military sexual trauma looks like to this particular person or this particular population of people. That's where qualitative comes in, right? You say, okay, well, let's contextualize this a bit, right? Sure, that may be true if you take this very narrow band, but how often is it the case that this narrow band is essentially what we're talking about? So things like what and how questions tend to fall more in the qualitative scheme, right? Okay, and then the final thing were the methods, right? The different quantitative and qualitative and mixed methods, right? So quantitative, of course, you have your surveys, which is probably the primary research method within the social sciences. You have experiments, right? Perhaps more within something like psychology, maybe. But experiments are pretty rare in the social sciences. Qualitative, you're talking about things like interviews, you're talking about participant observation, non-participant observation, ethnography, autoethnographies, things like that, right? All the different sort of qualitative methods that you can use. It usually boils down to either observation or interviews are the two primary methods. And sorry, I'm getting ready to walk out the door here. And then mixed, right? Which mixed is not, it's not different methods for each one. You're just using a combination of, perhaps surveys and interviews. But the real thing that you have to consider with mixed methods is the sequence, right? Are you doing things concurrently and giving equal weight to the different types of methods? Are you giving weight to one or more? Are you going to do a survey first and then do interviews, or interviews first and then do a survey? So those are the things that you have to consider, right? And we talked about those a bit in last week's discussion. So that's it, right? That's all you need to know about research methods in 20 minutes. No, there's a lot to know about this, but I hope that this class has been a good introduction for you guys. At least you'll have a sort of concept of what people are talking about when they're talking about things like qualitative, because you'll hear this all the time, right? When you look at methods, qualitative research, quantitative research, is one better than the other? Well, no, they're different, right? They do different things, and they're designed to do different things, and they're both equally valid in their own ways. Qualitative is not just opinions, right? I mean, people have to use rigorous methods to collect qualitative data. So while it may not, because you're not sampling in the same way, your sample has to be purposeful instead of random. It may not hold up to the same type of statistical generalization. Perhaps that's not your goal, right? Perhaps rather than generalizing to the larger population, you want to drill down into a particular population, or even understand something from a particular individual's perspective, right? And you think that maybe there may just be things that we can't generalize for whatever reason. So it really depends on what you want to know and how you want to know it. But anyway, I've enjoyed the course. I hope you guys have as well. If you need anything, this week, if you have any questions about the proposal, shoot them to me. If you need anything afterwards, if you want to actually carry out a research project somewhere in the future, I'd be happy to talk to you about that. If you need a letter of recommendation for something, happy to help out with that. But anyway, I enjoyed the class. I hope you guys did as well. Good luck on your proposal writing, and good luck on graduating. I know you guys are getting, a lot of you guys are getting pretty close, and you've had sort of a long road. And congratulate you on that, and stick with it. You're almost there. And hope you guys have a great rest of your summer.